I was speechless when I saw my wife arrive with another man, hand in hand, at the couple's dinner, as if I had never existed. The entire room seemed to stop, but it was I who left silently, taking with me the end of our story. The waiter extended the wine glass, but my hand remained still on the white tablecloth, damp, cold, sweating like my skin. Her laughter cut through the room like a razor, light, false, almost childish. She was wearing the blue dress I bought for our 3rd anniversary. Blue. She knew how much I loved her in that dress. She knew. And he squeezed her fingers as if the bond were years old. As if the intimacy between them was built on solid foundations, not the rubble of my marriage. All eyes turned to me. A couple nearby held their breath. Another woman whispered something in her partner's ear, who turned away awkwardly. Neither of them knew what to say. Neither of them knew what to do. And the only thing I could do was stand up, with the calm of someone holding back an earthquake, and leave. No one stopped me. Neither did she. On the sidewalk, the cold bit into my chest more than the night, and the street seemed too long for someone who had just lost their footing. The pain. The pain was a mixture of anger, disbelief, and a strange mourning for something that was still alive, breathing, but dead inside. I walked. I don't know for how long. I only know that I didn't look back. Not that night, nor the many that followed. Because I knew that if I looked, I would see what had always been there, and what I never wanted to see. She said, days later, with wet eyes and a broken voice, that I didn't deserve that. She said she was weak. Weak. As if cheating were a stumble. As if a slip. As if destroying someone inside could be justified by a moment of doubt. She cried. She asked for forgiveness. But she didn't have the courage to look me in the eye when she told me he'd disappeared. He didn't leave a note, nor an excuse. He just left. And he left her with empty hands, a cold bed, and the emptiness she chose. I listened to her. I didn't yell. I didn't humiliate her. I didn't throw her out. But I didn't stay either. Sometimes, what hurts the most isn't the yelling, it's the silence. Because the truth is, love doesn't die all at once. It gets sick. It bleeds slowly. And she killed ours with small choices. A silence here. A slight there. A flirtation disguised as friendship, an omission, a white lie, another gray one, until everything turned black. And even after that, she still thought I could be her plan B. She still thought there would be time. She still believed I would wait for her. But I didn't. Time passed. Slowly. But it did pass. And, little by little, I began to remember who I was before loving someone who didn't know what love was. I began to reconnect with life, with my own desires, my wishes, my silences. It was in the midst of this silent reconstruction that I discovered a new gaze. A serene, firm, respectful gaze. A gaze that didn't need to shout to be heard. She, the new woman, didn't come in as a substitute. No. She came in as someone extending a hand to someone ready to rise. And I was. It wasn't quick. It wasn't magical. But it was true. And when the woman who betrayed me realized she'd lost me, she tried to come back. She said she now knew what she wanted. That she was ready. That she'd understood everything. But it was too late. I listened to her, once again. She asked for forgiveness, again. And I gave it. Because harboring hatred is like digging a hole inside your own chest. And I didn't want to carry any of that anymore. I forgave. With a light heart. But I took a different path. And it was at that moment that she understood, who she had truly lost. She tried to rebuild her life. She tried to find in other faces what she once had with me. But in every laugh, in every bed, in every unfinished conversation, there was an echo of what we left behind. And worse than not having it is having already had it. Worse than never experiencing love is losing it by choice. Because regret doesn't come in the moment of betrayal. It comes in the silence afterward. When the phone doesn't ring. When the coffee goes cold. When no one asks how the day was. When there's no one left to return to. She lost me. And she lost herself too. Over time, I discovered that it was no longer pain that guided me, but peace. That it was no longer the memory of what I suffered, but the pleasure of building something new. I discovered that love also means knowing when to let go. That respect is non-negotiable. And that, no matter how much the heart insists, there are doors that should never be opened again. The curious thing is that she never betrayed me with her body first. It was with her soul. It was with the details. It was with the small gestures and the averted glances. The physical betrayal was just the last part. The easiest to see. The easiest to hate. But what destroyed our love was everything that came before, in silence. And that she can never fix. Time, that silent sculptor of life, did its part. It brought answers, healing, distances. It also brought encounters. And it was in one of these encounters that, by chance or fate, we met again. She, alone, older, sadder. I, beside someone who looked at me as if I were whole, not half. She smiled, tried to say something. I listened. I said I was fine. And in that moment, I saw in her eyes the most devastating pain of all, recognition. She acknowledged everything she'd lost. And for the first time, she felt everything I'd felt that night at dinner. The same loneliness. The same helplessness. The same silence. But now it was she holding the glass, waiting for someone who had already left. Years later, they said she'd gotten involved with someone, but she was never the same. That there were times when she'd get lost, staring into space. As if searching somewhere for the version of herself that once existed by my side. But she couldn't find it. Because that version died when she chose to cheat. When she traded what was certain for what wasn't. When she believed passion was more valuable than loyalty. When she left me sitting at that table, staring at the emptiness that, deep down, had always been inside her. And now, every time I think about that night, I don't feel anger. I feel gratitude. Because it was in that moment that everything began. The end of what was hurting me. The beginning of who I needed to become. And if someone asked me if I forgave her, I would say yes. But the most important thing wasn't forgiving her. It was forgiving myself for loving someone who never knew what love was. What she did was unforgivable, but what she lost, that was irreversible. And the most curious thing of all is that even after everything, even after being abandoned, betrayed, forgotten, I still managed to find true love. But her. She spent her life trying to replace what, deep down, she always knew was irreplaceable. The question that remains is, how could someone who had everything choose nothing? And the most shocking part was yet to come, because what she discovered, alone, years later, was what truly destroyed her completely. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize and we never support any form of betrayal. All the stories you hear are fictional, but they carry a profound truth: cheating destroys lives, homes, and entire hearts. Our goal is clear: to show, through real emotions, that the choice for loyalty is always the noblest. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is a strong, intense and unforgettable story. Take a deep breath. The truth hurts, but it needs to be told. His name was Daniel, and his face held the kind of serenity only those who have weathered storms at an early age can maintain. He was a man with calm gestures, measured speech, and a discreet sweetness in his eyes, something that became even more evident when he looked at her. Helena. The name itself carried something poetic. An intense, effortlessly elegant woman who seemed to have been sculpted from the smallest details, the way she arranged her hair in an imperfect bun when she was focused, the way she touched his wrist to demand attention, and that wide smile, sometimes spontaneous, sometimes rehearsed, but always magnetic. They met at a photography course Daniel attended on weekends, trying to fill the free time he had after his father's death. Helena, on the other hand, had been encouraged by a friend who swore the course was a perfect way to rediscover the wonder in the little things in life. Their first meeting wasn't memorable for either of them. Daniel was more introspective, speaking little, observing a lot. Helena was on a different wavelength, always surrounded by laughter, surrounded by people. But there was something there, a silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable. It was, in a way, welcoming. The closeness was subtle, almost shy. He helped carry equipment at the end of classes, she shared the umbrella on rainy days. No rush, no games. Just two strangers learning to enjoy each other's presence. They started going out to cafes, then to street markets, and before they knew it, they were choosing a frame together for a photograph he'd taken of her by chance, a blurry image of her staring at a reflection in a shop window, seemingly unaware that anyone was watching her. "You see me in a way no one else does," she said, touching the image with her fingers. And he, silently, just smiled. Then, Daniel understood that something bigger was brewing. It wasn't a simmering passion, the kind that burns quickly. It was something slower, deeper, rooted. Their relationship evolved naturally. They divided their time between their intense work routines, he as an editor at a cultural magazine, she as a coordinator at a language school, and quiet moments at home, cooking together, watching old movies, or simply strolling aimlessly through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood. They were accomplices, partners, and above all, friends. Helena often said that Daniel was her balance. And him? He said she brought color to gray days. There was no exaggeration between them, no grandiose promises or theatrical gestures. There was presence, consistency, and affection. They married in a small ceremony, surrounded only by close friends and family. They didn't want luxury, they wanted meaning. Her dress was simple, but the look on her face when she met Daniel at the altar was one of someone who knew exactly where she wanted to be. During their vows, he said he didn't promise perfection, but he promised to try every day. And she, with tears in her eyes, replied that that was enough. The wedding photos showed more smiles than poses, more spontaneity than protocol. A true portrait of who they were. The house they decided to live in had large windows and a modest balcony, but enough for the two to gaze at the sky while sipping wine on Friday nights. Helena brought her books, colorful pillows, and a peculiar way of organizing things, everything by color. Daniel brought his cameras, stacks of old magazines, and a cabinet full of coffee cups he'd collected since adolescence. They shared the space with ease, as if this home had been waiting for them even before they moved in. It wasn't long before Helena developed the habit of leaving notes scattered around the house. Small things, like, "Bring an umbrella," or "Only you know how to make the perfect coffee." Daniel, for his part, bought flowers on the most random days, he said it made the routine less predictable. On the surface, they seemed like the ideal couple. And in a way, they were. But like any long-term relationship, life began to take its toll. Commitments arrived, professional demands, the chronic fatigue of Mondays, and the silence of Sundays when the world seemed to slow down. Helena, with her usual restlessness, began seeking out new courses, new groups, new spaces where she could reinvent herself. Daniel, more reserved, retreated into books, movies, and the comfortable silence of someone who enjoys their own company. There was a small gulf growing between them. Small, but constant. And neither of them spoke about it. Not out of disinterest, but because they didn't quite know how to name what they felt. They still loved each other. There was still affection. But their conversations became more matter-of-fact, their touches more rare, and their eyes, which had previously sought each other constantly, now met without much pause. Still, every day, Daniel looked at her as if trying to rediscover something. As if waiting, patiently, for Helena to return to that place where they had once been whole. At some point, she started going out more. First with schoolmates, then with an amateur theater group that rehearsed on Wednesday nights. Daniel supported her. He always did. He told her she needed these connections, these new expressions. And Helena smiled gratefully. But over time, her returns home became more spaced out, her eyes more distant, and her words more brief. Sometimes she would come home with her face already washed, as if erasing part of herself before crossing the threshold. He noticed, but didn't ask. She felt it, but didn't say it. Still, there were respites. Weekend trips, lazy Sunday lunches, afternoons dozing on the couch with the television on low. They were like gentle waves breaking before the next high tide. But there was something in the air, something that settled in uninvited. Daniel began writing more. He resumed an old chronicle project, immersed himself in other people's stories to avoid facing his own. Helena began putting her cell phone away more carefully, changing her computer password, taking extra long showers. They were small gestures, almost imperceptible, but little by little, they rearranged the pieces of the puzzle. Daniel was a man of faith in love. He believed that when you truly love someone, you must respect even their silence. But even silence has its limits. And at times, he found himself staring at the cup of coffee she left half empty, trying to understand where they began to lose each other. Helena, on the other hand, struggled between the weight of routine and a confused desire to feel something different, new, perhaps more intense. But she wasn't evil. Never had been. She was just a woman trying to rediscover a part of herself she believed she'd left behind. And in this search, she forgot there was someone there, waiting for her with outstretched hands. There was love. There still was. But love alone sometimes doesn't hold up. It requires dialogue, presence, choice. And when these choices begin to follow opposite paths, love begins to grow weary. In the eyes of their friends, they remained a stable couple. In the photos, the smiles still lingered. On social media, the memories seemed alive. But inside, there were cracks. Small, yes. But when ignored, they grow. And it was on this shaky ground, between forgotten gestures and unspoken words, that the story began to change. Not all at once. But slowly, day by day. And even though no one there knew, even they didn't understand clearly, the love was no longer the same. It was there, yes. But hidden. And what would come next would be a direct reflection of the choices made during that period of silence. Because sometimes, what destroys a story is not the lack of love, but the excess of absence. And in that house where there had once been passionate notes and spontaneous laughter, there was now only a clock ticking away with cruel precision. Every minute, a countdown to the moment when everything would cease to be. Routine had settled between Daniel and Helena like an old piece of furniture forgotten in the middle of a living room, visible, taking up space, but no one bothered to move anymore. And it was this passivity that somehow held everything together. The days went by with cruel punctuality, coffee at 7, quick texts at noon, hurried dinners around 8, when one of them still had the energy to cook. The weariness of adulthood served as an excuse for increasingly long silences. She was immersed in new commitments, endless meetings with parents and teachers, cultural events sponsored by the school, night classes that piled up faster than she could complete. Daniel, for his part, increasingly withdrawn, devoted himself to writing as if clinging to the only part of himself that still made sense. Evenings together were now rare, and Sundays, once a ritual of tranquility and connection, became a series of absences disguised as obligations. There was still a kind of enduring affection between them. The occasional touch on the shoulder, the kiss on the forehead before leaving, the genuine concern when one of them fell ill. But none of this stopped the whole from growing. Helena seemed to be searching for something she couldn't name, and Daniel was beginning to realize that the space she occupied by his side wasn't quite the same anymore. And this gnawed at him silently. There were no arguments. There were no confrontations. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of conformity. Or maybe because they both still wished, somehow, for everything to go back to the way it once was. It was a rainy Wednesday when Daniel arrived home early to find the living room empty and a still warm cup on the table. The TV was off, the hallway lights on. He called out to her, but the only answer came from the wind blowing against the windows. In the bedroom, the slightly open closet revealed a fallen piece of clothing, as if someone had changed in a hurry. It wasn't common. Helena had always been meticulous with her things. He stood there, staring into space. There was no anger, no distrust, just a strange feeling that something wasn't where it should be. The doubt, however, didn't last long. In the following days, Helena's schedule became even more erratic. Sometimes she'd say the theater group's rehearsal had run long. Other times, she'd said she'd gone out to dinner with colleagues. The messages came more spaced out. Her voice on the phone was always hurried, as if any conversation were a nuisance. Daniel tried not to interpret it as indifference. He tried to believe it was just the weight of routine, the accumulation of commitments. But inside, something was stirring. An instinct he preferred to ignore, but which was already beginning to scratch the surface of the calm he so cultivated. It was one random night, between the steam from the shower and the damp towel thrown over the bed, that Daniel noticed the different scent lingering on her pillow. It wasn't the same as she usually wore. It was more woody, masculine. It hit him like an uncomfortable whisper in the dark. He said nothing. He simply observed her more closely in the days that followed. The short messages. The laughter on the phone that ceased when he approached. The new underwear, carefully hidden in the back of the drawer. The more elaborate makeup, even on days when she claimed she hadn't left school. Helena was distant. But it was a new distance, made of guilt, of surveillance, of unspoken choices. He began to question his own actions. Wondering if he hadn't failed to see her in the midst of his own pain. If his silence hadn't created too much space. But there was no denying the signs. They were everywhere. In the way she looked away when he talked about plans for the future. In the automatic way she hugged him before bed. And especially in her cell phone, which now slept beside her, always face down, always with notifications muted. Daniel had never been the suspicious type. He'd always believed that trust was the foundation of any relationship. But at that point it was no longer suspicion. It was instinct. It was on a Saturday afternoon, passing by a coffee shop they had frequented early in their relationship, that Daniel saw her. Sitting across from a man he didn't know. They weren't touching. There was no compromising gesture. But there was something in her eyes. A silent surrender, a lightness he hadn't seen in a long time. She smiled with a freedom he no longer had with him. Daniel's heart raced. Not because of the scene itself, but because of the internal confirmation of what he already knew. He didn't need to see anything explicit to understand. The love he knew had already shifted. That night, he said nothing. He waited for her to return. Helena came in wearing a perfume he had already learned to recognize, said something banal about the traffic, and went straight to her shower. Daniel remained in the living room, looking at one of the photographs he had taken of her years before. She was laughing, distracted, in a field of sunflowers. He remembered the exact day he took that photo. How she had run among the flowers, twirling her arms like a child, unaware that he was watching her from afar, enchanted. In that moment, he understood that that woman no longer existed. And worst of all, perhaps he himself was no longer the same man. In the following days, Daniel began to be absent as well. Not out of retaliation, but out of necessity. He began accepting invitations he'd previously declined. He began going to the movies alone. He walked through places they'd once been together. And in each of these spaces, he relearned to be silent with himself. Meanwhile, Helena immersed herself deeper and deeper in her own absence. She tried to maintain normalcy. She talked about school renovations, new projects, a body language course. But it all felt like filling a void she'd created herself. The night of the couple's dinner arrived without warning, like so many others. It was an annual event organized by close friends, a tradition that stood the test of time. Daniel hesitated to confirm his attendance, but in the end, he decided to go. Perhaps he wanted to face head-on what he already knew. Helena, on the other hand, insisted she would go alone. She said he had commitments, that it wasn't the kind of thing he liked. He simply nodded. He didn't argue. He knew there was a lie there. But he didn't want to find any more excuses. And it was there, under the yellow lights of the room, amidst fake laughter, clinking glasses, and conversations about careers and children, that everything revealed itself. Helena entered with the man at her side, hands clasped, smiles synchronized as if she had rehearsed it. Some guests stopped talking. Others hid their discomfort. Daniel, seated at the head of the table, looked up as if facing a sentence. There were no shouts. There were no confrontations. Only silence. A silence that permeated the entire room. He stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door as if carrying nothing. And indeed, at that moment, he no longer carried Helena. She had chosen to leave, even though she was there. She watched him leave, but didn't follow. Maybe out of fear. Maybe out of shame. Or because, deep down, she knew there was no turning back. The man beside her, visibly disconcerted, tried to hide it, but he didn't know where to place his hands. The looks around her were a mixture of judgment and pity. And Helena, for the first time, felt the weight of her choice not as liberation, but as loss. But what she didn't yet know, and what she would soon discover, is that the deepest pain wouldn't come from this exposure. It would come from what was about to be revealed. A truth she never imagined facing. And one that would forever change the meaning of what she thought she'd lost. 2 months had passed since that night. Time, with its cruel ability to move on even when everything inside seemed still, dragged Helena's days along with a suffocating slowness. At first, she tried to maintain her routine, as if normality could sweep away her shame. But routine was no longer possible. Daniel's presence had faded from the house like the scent of fresh coffee after hours, a memory that still lingered in the air, but could no longer be felt. He left without a note, without raising his voice, without asking questions. He simply closed the door. And this absence, this irreversible silence, was crueler than any argument. The man for whom she had risked everything disappeared shortly afterward, like a passing wind that only existed when it blew. Messages ignored, dates cancelled, promises evaporated. It was strange how everything seemed colder now, as if even the objects inside the house were in mourning. Helena walked from one room to the next as if searching for traces of what no longer existed. It was on a gray Sunday, the kind that seems to last a whole week, that she decided to go out. She wanted a breath of fresh air, to distract herself. She walked to the bookstore where she usually went with Daniel and, on impulse, went in. She expected not to see him, but there was a part of her that wanted exactly the opposite. And it was there, among the shelves and murmurs, that she saw something that paralyzed her, a dark-covered book with Daniel's name emblazoned on the side. The title was simple, but it betrayed a deep emotional charge. She picked it up with trembling hands. The pages smelled new, but the contents, inside were pieces of her, fragments of their marriage, scenes only the two of them knew. It wasn't fiction. It was testimony. He had written about everything. About love, about exhaustion, about silent loss. He didn't mention names. But she saw herself in every line. And she saw herself, too, in the way he poetically released her, as if there were no resentment, but a painful and mature acceptance. He sat on one of the benches, unable to feign control any longer. He wept silently, feeling naked before his own conscience. That same week, she decided to look him up. Not to ask for another chance. She already knew that didn't exist. But she needed to say something. Maybe to let him know she'd understood. Maybe to tell him she was broken. Or just to say goodbye with some dignity. She learned from mutual friends that he would be participating in an exhibition at an independent gallery, with his photographs being displayed for the first time in years. She arrived early, dressed simply, trying to appear less broken than she felt. When she saw him, her heart raced as it had the first time. He was smiling, talking to a woman with her hair tied back and calm eyes. There was a familiarity between them. A likeness. She understood without needing explanation. He moved on. But that wasn't what hurt. The real pain came minutes later, when she was approached by an acquaintance, a kind-faced woman who had worked with Daniel on a literary project. She approached naturally, as if unaware of the weight of the words she carries. She said she had read the book and was moved by the story about the day he rediscovered an old letter. Helena frowned. Letter? The woman, confused by her reaction, explained, Daniel had stumbled upon an old letter, kept in a box at the back of the closet. It was from Helena. Written in blue ink, on carefully folded pages. Words never sent. Words that, according to him, had closed the cycle in an unexpected way. Helena froze. The letter. That letter. She remembered. She remembered the day she'd written those words, years ago, when they were still together, but she'd already felt lost. A text that began with doubt and ended with fear. Fear that he'd discover that, somewhere, she was already thinking about giving up. She'd never had the courage to give it to him. She'd hidden it deep in a box of teenage things. And now, years later, that letter had returned to him. Returned as a warning of what had always been there, lurking. It was the testimony of the beginning of her downfall. A snapshot of the exact moment she began to lose herself within a relationship he was still fighting to save. The woman continued speaking, perhaps unaware of the impact of her words. She said Daniel had read the letter and decided to make it the final chapter of the book. Not to accuse you, he wrote, but to free myself. Helena left the gallery with tears in her eyes and trembling steps. The ground that had already disappeared now opened up into an even greater abyss. She hadn't just betrayed Daniel with another man. She had betrayed him long before, with unspoken thoughts, with silent surrenders, with cowardly choices. And he knew it. He knew because, at some point, she had written it down. Unintentionally, she had told him everything. That night, lying alone in a cold bed, she mentally reread every line of the letter. She remembered the weight of each sentence, the shame she felt as she wrote it, the guilt she tried to ignore. Now, everything made sense. His calmness as he left. The absence of revenge. He had already said goodbye even before the betrayal. Because the physical betrayal, though painful, was only the confirmation of a death foretold. What truly destroyed everything was the fact that, deep down, she had already given up, and he discovered this through the words he never had the courage to say aloud. The next day, driven by something she couldn't decide whether was courage or desperation, she sought him out. Daniel was at a cafe with the same woman from the gallery. They laughed softly, exchanging the look of someone building something from scratch. Helena approached. She asked to speak with him for a moment. Her new companion discreetly moved away. Helena sat down, looked at the man she once loved with all her heart, and said she had read the book. He nodded, emotionless. He said he wrote it to understand himself. She took a deep breath and, with a choked voice, said she now understood everything. She said she regretted not only the betrayal, but mainly not having fought for him when there was still time. Not having read his silence. Not having appreciated the small gestures. And finally, she said she now knew she deserved to lose him. Daniel listened attentively. He waited for her to finish. And then she replied in a calm but definitive tone, that she had forgiven. That the pain was over. That today there was gratitude for the story, but no longer love. And that, above all, he was at peace. Helen nodded with tears in her eyes and stood. She knew there was nothing more to say. As she walked back to the street, she felt the irreversible weight of her choices. For the first time, she understood that losing Daniel wasn't just losing a husband. It was losing the only place where she was seen whole. And that the love she took for granted was, in fact, the greatest gift she'd ever had, and one that would never return. Helena walked aimlessly through streets that once seemed familiar. There was a strangeness to everything, as if the world had changed color, texture, temperature. The places she once shared with Daniel now carried a painful shadow of absence, and even the smells of the city seemed to mock her attempt to pretend everything was fine. The cafe he loved, the bookstore on the corner, the newsstand where he bought old magazines, everything seemed to whisper his name silently, as if every corner reminded her that she no longer belonged to anything she once had. And now that he had moved on, now that she finally understood what she had lost, it all seemed too late. The following week, she received an unexpected invitation. Daniel's sister, with whom she had a respectful and cordial relationship, contacted her. She said Daniel had asked that some of his belongings be given to Helena, books, old photos, an analog camera they had used during a trip together. It was more than just returning objects. It was a symbolic closure. Her sister arranged to meet her at a small park where the three of them used to walk on Sundays, a place Helena had hardly been able to visit since their separation. She arrived punctually, sat on a wooden bench under the shade of a tree, and waited. The woman arrived minutes later, carrying a simple box. She was dressed serenely, like someone carrying a delicate mission. He sat beside her, without immediately speaking. He handed her the box with a restrained gesture. Helena received it with a lump in her throat, as if holding the ashes of a past that still burns. It was there, on that bench, that Daniel's sister decided to speak up. She said she didn't want to cause pain, but that she thought Helena needed to know what Daniel had experienced in the months before the separation. She explained that, for a long time, he had tried to keep the marriage together, not just with gestures, but with self-talk, with silent therapy, with attempts to reconnect with someone who was no longer present. She said he had even written a letter to Helena, but never delivered it. She said he believed, with an almost naive faith, that she was just confused, that the absence was temporary. And that, even when he began to suspect betrayal, he chose not to confront her. Because, in his words, love is also letting go when the other is gone. Helena listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to process the depth of Daniel's generosity. She felt ashamed. She felt a kind of pain that didn't scream, that was silent, suffocating, as if the tears had given up falling because they no longer knew what to express. At the end of the conversation, her sister said something that had been hammering in her head for days: "You didn't lose Daniel because of the betrayal. You lost him when you stopped seeing him. The betrayal was just the death certificate of something that was already dying." And with that, she got up and left, leaving Helena alone, with the box in her lap and a seemingly bottomless void. At home, she opened the box with trembling hands. Inside, she found black and white photos of them, spontaneous snapshots of a happiness that now seemed almost contrived. Among the books were old notes, texts he'd scribbled on loose sheets, shopping lists with hearts drawn in the corners. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a blue handkerchief she'd given him, was a small envelope. It was the letter. The one he'd never sent. Helena took a deep breath before opening it. Her hands were sweating, her chest ached. The text was short, but each word seemed written with the blood of someone suffering in silence. He said he knew. That he felt everything. That he'd noticed the distance, the lack of enthusiasm, the strange silences. That he missed her even when she was there, and that living with someone who no longer loved him was like sleeping in a room without oxygen. At the end, he wrote, "If you decide to leave, you don't have to explain. Just go lightly. Because even though I'm gone, I'll try to forgive you." The letter fell into her lap like a weight her body could no longer bear. She wept like someone trying to expel from themselves something that can no longer be undone. It wasn't for the mistake itself. It was for the clarity of how great Daniel had been. How much he had loved, even in silence. How much he had chosen dignity over revenge. And it was in that moment that Helena understood, it wasn't just about losing the man who loved her. It was about slowly becoming a version of herself she never imagined. In the days that followed, Helena tried to rebuild something. Not her marriage. She knew she wouldn't get that back. But she tried to rebuild herself as a woman, as a human being. She sought help, distanced herself from circles that reinforced her ego and vanity. She returned to writing, revived projects she had abandoned out of insecurity. She began to reconnect with herself. And amid this lonely and painful process, she found a kind of peace that came not from redemption, but from facing her own truth. A year later, by chance, the two crossed paths again. It was a spring afternoon, and Helena was sitting in a cafe reading a book when she heard a familiar voice calling her name. It was Daniel, as serene as ever, now with a new sparkle in his eyes. He was accompanied by the woman from the gallery, who smiled kindly. There was a polite silence between the three. She stood, he greeted her naturally, and for a few seconds, they stood face to face, like two former lovers recognizing each other as survivors of a war they both lost. He introduced her to his new companion lightly. Helena, surprisingly, smiled back sincerely. There was no rancor. There was a gentle melancholy, like someone looking at an old photograph and remembering a time that will never return, but was real. Before leaving, Daniel said something that stayed with her for a long time. Time doesn't restore what's lost, but it teaches us to live with what's left. Helena nodded. She said she was happy to see him well. And when they said goodbye, there were no hugs, no promises, no longing glances. Just respect. The same dignity he had maintained until the end. Alone at the table, Helena sat for a few minutes staring at her coffee cup. Time passed, but within her, traces of that story still lingered. And she knew she would live with it for the rest of her life. Not as eternal guilt, but as a reminder of what had been. Because the greatest punishment wasn't loneliness. It was knowing she'd held, in her hands, the kind of love most people never find. And lost it. Not for lack of love, but for lack of courage to fight for it when it was still possible. After that brief reunion at the cafe, time began to move differently within Helena. She sat there for long minutes, staring at the empty table before her, as if she could still hear his voice echoing amidst the street noises. There was no longer any sharp pain, but there was no peace either. It was like an echo of everything said and felt, a suspended space between what could have been and what had actually become. Seeing Daniel so serene, beside someone who exuded tranquility, had held a mirror before her, not a mirror that reflected the face, but one that revealed the soul. It was impossible not to recognize the contrast between the man she had destroyed and the man he had become. And more than that, it was impossible to ignore the woman she had become in the process. She had been complicit in her own ruin, sweeping the truth under the rug until there was no more room to step. And now, she walked over the remaining shards, trying not to bleed anymore. In the days that followed, she told no one about their reunion. She didn't talk about his new wife, nor the calm look he gave her, nor the absence of any trace of hurt. She kept it as something too intimate, like a secret that didn't need to be exposed because no one would understand. It was a kind of pain that didn't scream, but remained there, constant, like the sound of an antique clock in an empty house. Helena tried to return to her commitments, the people around her, the ordinary distractions. But everything seemed superficial. She began to question the value of conversations, the weight of choices, the true motivation behind daily gestures. She realized how much she had lived under a veil of vanity and expectation, seeking in others the validation that should have come from within. And now, even in the face of new invitations, new interests, new suitors, there was a part of her that no longer moved. As if that old version was buried beneath everything she chose to ignore. As if loving again required a kind of courage she no longer possessed. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life discreetly. The book he had published had gained quiet recognition, the kind of work that touches those who have experienced something similar, that awakens empathy in those who have felt the same pain. It wasn't a bestseller, but it was reverently discussed in more sensitive circles. His name, previously associated with cultural chronicles, was now remembered as someone who had the courage to tell a story from the inside out. Someone who didn't seek revenge, who didn't expose, who simply wrote truthfully. His new partner was someone who respected his silences, who didn't try to compete with the past, but who built an honest present with it. Friends saw them as a couple who complemented each other without dependence, who smiled without euphoria, who shared life with balance. Daniel had, indeed, found a new path. And this path, unlike the previous one, required no more effort to maintain. Just presence. One night, Helena sat down to write. The blank paper stared back at her like a canvas demanding confession. She wasn't sure who she was writing to, Daniel, herself, or a version of herself still begging for forgiveness. The words came slowly but surely. She told him what she'd felt since everything fell apart. She spoke of the regret that shadowed her, of the sleepless nights she'd spent imagining what it would have been like if she'd faced her own fears before letting it all slip away. She said she'd learned to recognize the ego disguised as freedom, the need disguised as independence, the pride disguised as self-confidence. She said she now knew that betrayal didn't begin with a kiss, but with silent surrender, with the small choices that tear a couple apart without them even realizing it. She wrote about the void left behind, about the woman she was trying to rebuild, and about the love she recognized now, too late, as the love of her life. When he finished the letter, he had no intention of delivering it. It was simply a way of sorting through the debris. But there, in that text, was an honest version of himself, a version that didn't apologize, hoping for a fresh start, but rather admitted what had happened, unapologetically. He put the letter away in a drawer, unnamed, undated. And he decided that perhaps one day he would let it be found. Or perhaps not. The important thing was that he had written it. On the other side of the story, Daniel maintained his serene pace, but he wasn't indifferent to the past. From time to time, he visited old places, reread passages from his own book, and recalled scenes that marked his journey. Not out of nostalgia, but out of respect. He didn't run away from what he'd experienced, didn't erase the good times, or try to rewrite the bad. He carried everything like someone who knows that certain wounds become scars and that scars are proof of survival. His new companion accompanied him through these moments with understanding, not out of curiosity, but out of affection. She knew that true love doesn't begin from scratch, but from those who have already loved and learned. And Daniel loved. Deeply. With surrender, with flaws, with waiting. And for that very reason, now, he could love again with maturity. One day, while organizing old papers for a photography exhibition, he found the old card Helena had left in the frame of one of his favorite pictures. It was a simple note, written when they were still married, in which she said she loved seeing him behind the lens because he seemed free there. Daniel read those words with a slight smile. There was no more pain, just the realization that, even in relationships that end, some things remain beautiful. He decided not to keep the note. Instead, he placed it in a box along with other memories, not to forget, but to remember that love, when true, is not erased by pain, only transformed. At the same time, Helena was beginning to understand that her journey wouldn't be about regaining what she lost, but about accepting what she destroyed and trying to make something better with what was left. She began teaching at an NGO, returned to school, and began listening more than talking. The days were still lonely, but now there was more silence than guilt. I didn't know if I would love again, but I knew I was no longer looking for someone to heal, but rather to share. And that, in itself, was a start. One afternoon, while walking through a local art fair, she noticed a photograph on display from afar. It was her image, taken by Daniel years before, reflected in a display case, like a mirror. The caption simply read, "The moment before the distance." She paused there for a moment, observing herself frozen in a moment that no longer existed. Beside the photo were others, of different people, different stories, but this one was the only one priceless. And she understood why. Some things can't be sold, touched, or relived. They can only be respected. And as the fair's lights began to dim and the exhibitors closed their tents, she walked out with slow but steady steps. The weight still lingered, but now she carried it with awareness. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could live the present with more honesty. And perhaps, in the future, this truth would lead her to a new place, not to erase what she'd experienced, but to build something new, with more maturity, more humility, and, above all, more courage. Because in the end, she understood, it wasn't his absence that destroyed her, it was her own absence, at a time when she most needed to be whole. And now, with all her scars exposed and her soul mended, she was, for the first time, ready to face what was truly left after love. A few months had passed since the art fair, and Helena now walked with slower steps, not out of fatigue, but out of awareness. For the first time in years, each step seemed clearly reflected in her mind. There was no longer the urgency to prove herself to anyone, not even to herself. Her daily life had become less about noise and more about listening. She had learned to listen to the sound within, the one that echoes when all other silences cease. She began to allow herself to frequent other spaces, not to distract herself, but to reconnect. She joined a silent writing group, where each member wrote about losses and new beginnings. There were no debates, just anonymous sharing left in envelopes on a table. Some letters touched her deeply, others made her uncomfortable. But it was in this confrontation that she felt she was still alive. One night, she read a note that said, "You have to lose everything you thought was essential to discover what truly sustains you." And for a moment, she wondered if that note had been written by Daniel. But the handwriting wasn't his. Still, she kept those words with her for days, as if they were mirrors of what she herself had ignored for so long. One autumn morning, while reviewing the paperwork for the NGO where she now worked, she received an unexpected email. It was from Daniel's new partner. Direct, polite, respectful. She said she'd like to talk, not out of resentment or pressure, but out of a desire to close some cycles. Helena hesitated. The invitation carried a silent, almost absurd tension, but also aroused a curiosity she couldn't deny. She responded, saying she was willing. They arranged to meet at a botanical garden in the city center, a public, neutral place, where the sound of nature could soothe any discomfort. The meeting took place on a cloudy but mild morning. The woman arrived first, sitting on a bench beneath a leafy tree. Helena recognized something in her that wasn't beauty or poise, it was stability. There was a calm firmness in her eyes, an unhurried way she stood and extended her hand. They greeted each other with a restrained nod and sat side by side, without hesitation. The initial silence was broken by the woman who, looking straight ahead, said in a calm voice, "I didn't come here to compete with any memories. Nor to say what he feels or doesn't feel. I just wanted to understand, how you came to the point of letting him go like that." Helena took a few seconds to respond. She looked at the floor, then at her hands, as if searching for words between her fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but firm. "I didn't realize it. And when I did, I thought there was still time. The truth is, I lost him long before I cheated on him. And I no longer recognized myself." The woman nodded. The wind blew lightly, carrying dry leaves between their feet. There was no judgment on her face. Just genuine listening. After a few seconds, she asked, "Do you still love him?" Helena hesitated. The question, though simple, carried disproportionate weight. She took a deep breath before answering. "Yes. But not in the same way. Today, it's a different love. Perhaps more mature. A love that understands that not everything you love can be recovered." The woman smiled slightly. A sad but understanding smile. She said she'd known from the beginning that there was a deep history there. That she'd never tried to erase it. But that Daniel was free. And that he'd chosen to be with her not because of a lack of past, but because of a choice of future. "He doesn't talk about you much," she continued. "But when he does, there's respect. There's no anger. And that, to me, says it all. Helena lowered her head. Not out of shame, but out of involuntary respect for that woman who, in that moment, displayed more greatness than many people in a lifetime. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, exchanging stories, impressions, reflections on new beginnings. When they said goodbye, there were no hard feelings, no promises, no long hugs. Just a direct, sincere look, as if acknowledging the other's pain without wishing to take it upon themselves. Helena returned home with a strange feeling, a mixture of relief and loss, as if a part of her had finally been buried with respect. In the following days, she decided to do something she had avoided since the end of her marriage. She visited the old house. Not to break in, but to see from afar. She knew it had been rented by another family, and she hadn't expected to find anything other than new curtains and perhaps garden toys. But when she reached the gate, she felt an unexpected wave of emotions. It was like seeing a moving picture. Memories tumbled together, not as happy or sad scenes, but as fragments of what she had built and destroyed in that place. She leaned against the tree in front, where Daniel used to string lights at Christmas. And there she stayed for a few minutes, until a child appeared at the window, a dark-haired boy with a curious look. He smiled at her. Helena smiled back. This was a new time. And she, despite everything, was alive to recognize it. That night, she wrote another letter. Not to Daniel. Not to herself. But to the love she'd experienced. She thanked him. She apologized. She said goodbye. She closed by saying, "You weren't perfect. Neither am I. But even imperfect, we were real. And that, I understand now, is greater than any happy ending." As she folded the paper and tucked it into an envelope with no destination, something inside her settled. It wasn't redemption. It was acceptance. A silent understanding that some stories don't come back. But that they don't need to be erased for others to exist. And that sometimes, moving on isn't about finding someone else, but about finally letting the past rest in peace. The moral dilemma, in the end, was this: what to do with a love lost through your own fault. How to move on, knowing that the other person's pain was a direct result of your choices. The answer might not be to forgive yourself, nor to find a new love. Perhaps it was simply to carry what happened with dignity. Transforming guilt into learning. And understanding, once and for all, that there are losses that don't define us, but that shape us with just the right force to never repeat the same mistakes again. Autumn arrived again, and with it the bittersweet smell of dry leaves covering the sidewalks, the colder wind seeping through the cracks in the windows, and the memory of time passing without asking permission. That year, nothing would be the same, nor as expected. Life, with its subtle irony and relentless precision, had put each piece in its place, even those that, for so long, seemed off the board. Helena now lived alone in a small apartment, simply decorated but charged with meaning. Everything there had been chosen by her, as if each object were an attempt to rebuild her own identity, now stripped of the illusions and vanities that had guided her for so long. There was no longer any rush, no subterfuge. Coffee was made for one, books were piled high in the corner of the living room, and the long nights were filled with an uncomfortable but necessary peace. She had begun speaking at schools, talking about choices, about emotional responsibility, about the risks of self-sabotage disguised as freedom. He didn't position himself as a victim or a perpetrator. He spoke as if he knew, firsthand, what it was like to miss the essential because he couldn't see it in time. One morning, while organizing some old files on a forgotten flash drive, she found a folder with short videos Daniel had recorded on trips, birthdays, and everyday scenes. Among them was an unfinished video, the two of them, laughing on the couch, eating popcorn, talking about a bad movie. He turns to her and says something Helena had never paid attention to at the time, but which now seemed like a closed code: we just have to keep choosing each other, even on the hard days. The screen freezes on her smile, before the video cuts out for lack of space. It hit her like a final mirror. She closed the laptop calmly, but with tears streaming down her face. She realized that the worst pain was no longer what she felt, but what she remembered he felt alone. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life discreetly, but no longer with the same detachment as before. Time had healed him honestly, not by erasing memories, but by giving each one new meaning. He now lived with Isabella, the woman who had entered his life unintentionally, but who had ended up becoming his home. They bought a house in a more remote neighborhood, surrounded by trees and silence. One afternoon, while organizing the new office they would share, Daniel pulled a black and white photograph from an old box. Isabella looked, recognized Helena in the image, but said nothing. She simply observed. Daniel, with a calm gesture, put the photo away in a folder and said that that part of his story had shaped him, but no longer defined him. Isabella smiled and responded with something that sealed the moment: those who truly love are not afraid to recognize where they came from. And it was then that he realized he had found something he was no longer looking for, not just a new love, but a new beginning, free from the weight of the past. On a drizzly afternoon, Daniel was invited to give a talk on art and emotional reconstruction. At the end of the event, a young woman approached and said she had read his book several times and that, thanks to it, she had decided to end an abusive relationship. Daniel thanked her, touched, and realized the full extent of everything he had experienced. He understood that his pain, when shared truthfully, not only healed him but also served as a beacon for those still walking in darkness. Lost love had left scars, but also seeds. And now, they were blossoming in unexpected ways. A few months later, Helena bumped into Isabella by chance in a bookstore. The encounter, unexpected and silent, was unconstrained. Just recognition. They exchanged a quick glance, and for a moment, there was a tacit peace between them. Isabella approached, said she had read one of the anonymous letters Helena had written in the silent writing group. She said she knew, by the way the words were arranged, that it was from her. She said she cried. That she felt empathy. Helena thanked her. And, with teary eyes, she simply said, "Take good care of him." Isabella responded gently, without irony, without superiority, "He already knows how to take care of himself, but I'm here to walk alongside him." And with that, the two said goodbye, each returning to their separate paths, aware that some paths don't need to cross again to be at peace. Helena returned home that night and finally decided to publish a text under her own name. An article about the silent effects of emotional betrayal. About how absence isn't formed in grand events, but in small, daily absences. The text went viral, and she was invited to speak on the subject at several events. She became a reference for something born of her failure. And, although the past never ceased to exist, she could now look at it honestly, without the need for justification. She hadn't redeemed herself, because some guilts can't be erased, but she had found purpose in the pain. The final scene of this story didn't unfold with grand gestures or theatrical reunions. It happened one morning, when Daniel, in his garden, saw his daughter, the fruit of his new relationship, running across the lawn with an old camera in her hands. It was the same camera he used when he photographed Helena. The child turned and said, "Daddy, take a picture of me laughing, I want to see what love looks like in the portrait." Daniel smiled, took the camera from her small hands, and in that moment, everything fell into place. Love doesn't die, it changes form. It teaches. It follows. And Helena, in turn, was closing the curtains in her living room that same morning, a book in her hands and a hot tea on her lap. There was peace in her eyes. Not complete happiness, but something more precious, lucidity. Because after all, you learn that the greatest proof of love isn't always persisting, but letting go when the other person is no longer happy by your side. You learned, in the most painful way possible, that betrayal isn't just touching another body, it's abandoning a heart that was still trying. And with that, you could finally rest within yourself. If this story touched you in any way, leave a comment. We want to hear your thoughts on all of this. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this. Here, you'll find real, intense, and purposeful narratives. Because we believe in the power of love, but also in the truth of pain. And remember, cheating doesn't just destroy a relationship. It destroys trust, affection, projects, and, in many cases, the very identity of the perpetrator. Cheating is opening a wound that may never completely heal, and that, even when it does, leaves deep scars. Our channel does not support any type of betrayal. On the contrary, we want, through these stories, to show that loyalty, respect, and communication are the true pillars of any lasting love. Until the next story.